It's been a real delight for me to work with Andrew Apparel on this series, which he curated. He is, all of you know him already, not only very, very knowledgeable about the art of about the music of the 18th century, but he knows a lot about the historical context and about the way in which the music you'll be hearing tonight is reflected in the art and architecture and history and fashions of the time as well. So it's been really a delight to work with Andy. And he's joined this evening by a special guest, Mary Tav Holmes, who holds a PhD from NYU's Institute of Fine Arts with a specialty in Baroque and Rococo European art. She has worked as a curator, an author and teacher in European art for over 30 years, specializing in 18th century French drawings and paintings. Her publications include A Magic Mirror, the portrait in France from 1700 to 1900, 18th century French drawings in New York collections, which accompanied an exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum, and Nicolas Lancret, 1690 to 1743, which was written for an exhibition at the Frick Collection, and she's also the author of several children's books. She's just co-curated an exhibition on the Fêtes Galantes for the Musée Jacques-André in Paris, which is open, I believe, through July. And so as a specialist of the Fêtes Galantes, she's the perfect guest to join Andy Apparel in a conversation about tonight's program on A Weekend in the Country, Evocation and Escape. So please join me in welcoming them.
I'm always kind of amused when people say how much I know, because I'm constantly bumping into people that remind me how little I know. And there's a kind of creative insult in meeting people who know so much, because you just see these enormous areas of information you didn't have, and it puts everything into a different perspective. Paul Leclair, when he spoke to us last time, mentioned the work of Robert Darnton, when he was saying that what they read in the 18th century wasn't Rousseau and Voltaire, they read smut. And so I immediately went out and got a couple of his books. My God, I know nothing. And so what a pleasure. It's a combination, it's a pleasure, but there's such disturbing information about a period in which we feel maybe the entire world was a fête galante. It really wasn't. And to get a real picture and see how information gets around and how behavior is more varied and more disturbing than you would ever thought is a revelation. And so if you speak to me in another couple of weeks, I'll know more than I do now. But when I met Tav originally and went to her apartment to speak about the possibility of joining us, I thought I knew a lot about Fêtes Galantes, and I didn't. And so I went out of the apartment sort of with a swollen head of information, delivered in a way which was so colorful and so meaningful, so that I was really delighted that she would come and she would talk to us about that. And it's a particularly good moment because she's just back from Paris, where her beautiful exhibition and beautiful catalog, which is available with essays, is just launched. Before we talk about that, I just wanted to say that the program that we're actually playing of music refers to the countryside and nature with various attitudes. Some of them idealized, and the last cantata by Rameau, called the Ile de Delos, is a mythological place of wonder and perfect love. But the peasant dances of Rameau are rough-hewn and done with wooden shoes, and they're uncomfortable with vitality and a lack of sophistication. And the birds, which Rameau wants to give us, some of them are very sweet, and some of them are really noisy and really annoying. So the music is referring to nature in various ways, mythological and very, very real. So I think that in speaking about the Fêtes Galantes and nature behind it and the relationship to what we see, we'll have a really good context for a lot of this music. And so that we start at the beginning. Tav, what's a Fête Galante?
Well, when I spoke to Andy about the subject of the Fête Galante, I said that one of the misconceptions, I think, is that people concentrate on the word fête. The change that occurs in the Regency period of France in the art of Watteau is really held in the word galante. It's not so much the word fête. There have been fêtes in art for hundreds of years prior to Watteau, it's the Galant piece that is the new piece. And to a Frenchman of the Regency period, the word galant was imbued with huge and nuanced underpinnings. They include contemporary life, a treasuring of women and an understanding of women as important intellects. They include the urge to mix with theater and with dance. They include the art of conversation as a meaningful subject for a painting. So the word galant goes a long way towards explaining why they would think it was all right to have a painting in which, as they say in the 18th century, nothing is happening. I think of it as sort of the Seinfeld of the early 18th century. Because in Watteau's paintings, there is no narrative, except for the conversation being had, the strolling outside in a social landscape, a landscape described and developed to hold human beings in accord. And when we did this exhibition, it was very entertaining to have the French press come and look at the Fêtes Galantes because they were miserable looking at it. There was just too much accord happening in this painting. And they seek discord and always were asking, but what about the French Revolution? And I would say, well, it's a very long century. You're only in 1709. You have to give people a chance. But it's the galant word. They named their newspaper the Mercure Galant. It is a word that bespeaks not just gallantry, but contemporary life, contemporary costume, an awareness that human conversation is where the intellect can really shine, that music and discourse and dance are good reasons to make a painting and to create a landscape around that accord. That is a Fêtes Galantes.
Now, and this thing of nothing happening, I will ask you to think about that when you listen to the Rameau cantata, because nothing happens. Unlike an Italian cantata, for instance, where there's a real action, where there's probably either a suicide or a rape or a murder or something like that. Absolutely nothing happens in this entire cantata, but a series of reflections on the perfection of the place where we find ourselves.
Which is very like.
And where do these things take place? You all have pictures of various Fêtes Galantes in front of you, and the Watteau one, which is the early one, kind of the kind of major tulip bulb of all, which is the one without a frame, and which has the most. Well, yeah, that's it.
That's cool.
Where do these take place? For Watteau, where does he put them?
Well, when is the title of our evening Escape?
It's a Weekend in the Country or Escapes.
So one of the things that I think needs to be understood, and again, when I was talking to the journalists, they constantly ascribe escapist and or elitist urgings into 18th century French paintings. And my reply to that, and I would reply to that in the sense of where do they find themselves. What Watteau is trying to describe is less an escape and more an ideal, more a hoped for, more a utopian vision than an elitist escapist vision. After all, he thought he was somebody who was raised in a very war-torn world and was born in Valenciennes, which changed horses nationally during his lifetime and was just constantly being overrun with troops of one sort or another. It's more of a utopian vision than it is an escapist vision. He's describing a world where conversation is where difficulties are ironed out, instead of in his own world where people came across the fields with their muskets. So this is more of a utopian notion than an escapist notion, really. In terms of the art history framework, Watteau himself was creating a landscape from Italian drawings that he had access to in collections in France. He himself never went to Italy. but he saw Italian paintings and drawings and made copies. He saw Netherlandish painting, and he imagined. They aren't meant to be seen as, a real vista out a window. They are creative, and they are a devotedly social landscape. They're created to hold these people, to have benches for these people, to have statues where their attitudes are refined and described by Venus or by a dolphin. They are social landscapes with social interactions on them. They are made up.
So who are the people?
And do I take questions?
Not yet, let's hold it.
Oh, I knew there would be a.
Yeah.
The people are a mixture. There are some of them contemporary people in incredible finery. He had a number of models who came to his studio and he drew them, especially the attitudes of their heads. He had a particular love of the back of the neck. So I think when you go looking at Fêtes Galantes paintings, just make sure you pay attention to the back of the female neck, because he thought that was the best looking part of any girl. And all the drawings there, it really is. You start like stalking people and looking at their necks. But he drew models and he dressed them. But also he saw theater, and some of the people are from the Commedia dell'arte, which was in Paris at the time. During the beginning of Watteau's life, they were a contraband theater group, but they came back in under the Duc d'Orléans. But he put those theater figures in. They are musicians, they are dancers, they are an elaborate corps.
And this mixture you're
But
talking
they're all
about,
very good looking. They're very good looking. They're not ugly.
this mixture of people, is that based in a reality, or is that, would you have in the garden members of the dance corps, members of the theater corps, nobility, things like that, all talking together and sharing hors d'oeuvres? And
This is a debate, that is a debated idea. There was a very good book by Thomas Crow about the 18th century where he says that the Fêtes Galantes was a real action that was possible at Sceaux, for example, in the house of the Duchesse de Main, that she had Commedia dell'arte people come and make a parade through her parties. But in the way that it is expressed in Watteau's work, it was not a real activity. There were picnic outdoor activities, and the Commedia figures, you might hire a theater troupe to come. But the way he has arranged them is outside the real. Yeah.
who bought paintings? You're talking about this as an idealized world. You have these paintings, these Fêtes Galantes. Who wants them? Is this something that we find that the noble families and royal families buy? Who's the real market for this particular art form?
One of the things that surprises people when they look at the history of it, when I talk about the 18th century, and this is a sad admittance, but I'm always talking pre-revolutionary because that's sort of where I stop and where somebody else starts. So the things that I'm talking about all stopped in 1789. But in terms of the development of the Fêtes Galantes, after Watteau, the next group of artists will want something different. They will want to have a different patronage. They will want to change the works of art. And then the next generation and the one after that. So when Watteau starts this, it is very much an art developed by dealers and bought by the financiers and the upper middle class. It is not for a royal patronage. These are small paintings with small figures. They tend to be somewhat dark. Watteau was not a trained academician, and his paintings have suffered over time, but they were always fairly dark to begin with. And they just couldn't be hung in the vast spaces that a royal commission might require. But very quickly, the next group of painters will want to make a better living, just like anybody else, and they'll be academics. He will enter the world of academic painting, and the next group of artists will be academically trained. And they will start to bring the figures closer to the picture plane, make them bigger, reduce them in number, make them far more colorful, and put in a little narrative. And those paintings start to get bought by the king and by Frederick the Great of Prussia and by other very, very Tony people. But the first group are all bankers, financiers, and dealers. And the greatest owner of Watteau was a man named Jean de Julien, who owned the Gobelin tapestry manufactory, and who had engravings made after all of the paintings and drawings. And it was those engravings that diffused the style across Europe.
So when a successful bourgeois, wealthy person who is able to collect buys a Fêtes Galantes, what is it that he sees in the painting that for him is, besides just its being pretty, I mean, what does he see in that that relates to his condition and what for him is valuable in the world?
By the time the early 18th century rolls around, the idea that nature held the answer, that the simpler things in nature were of importance, had taken on heft. So Watteau was offering a way, a very intellectual way, a very heightened way of interacting with nature without sacrificing civilization. So that's what they're seeing. They're imagining a life that has both aspects in it, that they can join them. And it was, France at the time that Watteau came along, besides that the painting itself had a stultifying quality. There's a reason you're not going to go out and see an exhibition of paintings from, say, 1702, because they were pretty boring looking paintings and very dogmatic. And they had no real life. I mean, Italian painting was still holding the throne, and French painting had really suffered. And the French life had, Louis was living with Madame de Maintenon, who was a very dour sort of person, and they had had terrible wars, and they were shortly to have, in 1709, the worst freeze ever. And the price of bread went out the ceiling. Life was very, very hard. And what you would look at in a Watteau was, aside from the sheer genius of the creativity and the beauty of those images, this image that you could join with nature in a very civilized, intellectual way and create a great life. Lived in there. This is something that you said to me that's very interesting. In the first suite of harpsichord pieces I'm going to play by Rameau, the suite begins with 3 or 4 dances that are very sophisticated and citified. Mm-hmm. And then all of a sudden we're thrown into a bird cage of screaming crows, and from then on it's really raucous peasant dance music to the end. And I've always had a hard time figuring out how is it that he's put these things together, and it's almost he doesn't really prepare us for it, and you have these two opposite worlds, and it's always beguiled me. But I mentioned that to you, and what was your response to it? One of the things that gets, I think, overlooked about the 18th century is it was the Enlightenment, and they had a huge grasp of art and literature traditions and musical traditions. And one of the great traditions that they understood was the contrast between city and country. And it's an established trope in the storytelling and in the paintings. So that Louis XV could have in his Petit Appartement a painting of the city après la chasse and the country après la chasse. And the country après la chasse is by Nicolas Leclair, and they're outside and they're having a whale of a time, and their wigs have all come off and they've broken all the bottles, and the dogs are eating the ham, and they're just having a terrific time. And in the city one, which is by Detroit, they're eating oysters, and they're inside a grand salon with gilded everythings, and that is an established trope. So the contrast of different kinds of life was a very established trope, and that contrast is something they enjoyed.
And one of the things that I was able to get in having Tav tell me that is that there's so many examples in which you'll have 2 dances next to each other, one of them very courtly and one of them much more raucous and out there, and the contrast, which is enjoyable, is not a surprise that it's there. it isn't a surprise that you have these two together, but it's one of the delights is that you see, oh, here's the cinephile thing and here's the country thing. And we see that so often in French music. Those two things play side by side. Another thing that you'll notice today too is that, though in a different way, is that the bird piece that I will play on the harpsichord is these crazed, horrifying crows that will not shut up. But the bird aria that Rosa will sing very soon afterwards is these exquisite little songbirds that come right out of the Fêtes Galantes.
Right.
I don't think the crows would find themselves in a Fête Galante, but that brings me to the question is, how does nature change? And the relationship of these people who are in the Watteau painting, there they are, woven into nature in a way where you don't sense any threat going on. Does the understanding of nature over the generations change?
Well, just one more thing about it. I mean, that city and country trope was a part of folklore, you know, for hundreds of years before the 18th century, and you can still buy children's books now that are city mouse, country mouse, where they swap places. I mean, so that's something, that understanding, I think, is a very old one. In terms of the change in nature, it's more of just a change generally across the century of what the Fête Galante was doing. The Fête Galante was a very fluid mechanism. It had very few boundaries. It did not have a theoretical basis. So if you think of that social landscape as sort of the background of a tapestry almost, and then other threads get woven in as the century wears on that change it, leaving sort of the background tapestry in place, but you know, maybe a reality thread or a portrait thread or some other kind of thread weaves through it. And as the century gets towards the revolution, one of the things that begins to happen is everything becomes more elaborate, more grand or grandiose, and sometimes more alarming. So as you get closer to the revolution, nature becomes, there are images where the people shrink and nature becomes much more overwhelming as a force, where there might be, you know, trees that are much more jagged looking, where the formerly peaceful pond ends in a crashing waterfall. I mean, that it starts to begin to be a part of the general sort of fearful quality of life. So, of course, the Fête Galante as a very fluid mechanism reflects what's going on around it very directly, absolutely.
Tell me, what happens to it? In the 19th and then towards the end of the 19th century, does it disappear? Is it something where it's so against the grain of someone like Giraudet or David that it's just simply not going to continue on? And where do we see it coming back? We see Debussy writing suites that are very similar to Couperin suites, both in the names of the pieces and in the sense of ordering a series of four or five character pieces that are so similar to Regency, elegance and taste and humor and wit and sensuality. And Debussy's one of his greatest piano pieces is actually a meditation on the embarkment for Citer of the great Watteau Fête Galante. What happens to it in terms of artists? And who throws it out? Who takes it back?
Well, the 19th century, David, just to start with David, adored Fragonard and was his pupil and was responsible for bringing Fragonard back to Paris after the Revolution, where Fragonard lived in the Louvre and became an administrator. He never painted again. But David's beginnings are really, his earliest portraits have much of the Rococo about them, and he was Fragonard's student. I think that the 19th century artist understood the Fête Galante as a revolutionary way to use landscape painting, as a social mechanism, as a mechanism without theoretical boundaries, which was extremely appealing to a 19th century artist. While not art for art's sake per se, it certainly allowed a scope within the painting that was completely outside the academic realm and was very innovative. And so a 19th century artist would find that extremely appealing. I think Manet and Seurat simply wouldn't exist if it weren't for the Fête Galante. I mean, I think Manet's Déjeuner sur l'herbe, it has its obvious underpinnings in the Giorgione/Titian painting, but that painting was seen by Watteau and understood by Watteau and then by Manet, if you see what I'm saying. And Seurat, really, there was a terrific French artist in the 18th century, Gabriel de Saint-Aubin, who was a boulevardier, and he strolled and drew and strolled and drew, and he had a huge understanding of the Fêtes Galantes. But he incorporated contemporary Paris very directly, very acutely into his imagery. So you would see, for example, a scene of these wonderful people outside in the Tuileries Gardens, and he would include the date and that chairs had just been introduced into the Tuileries so you could now sit down. And this was exactly that moment. So those people outside in the Tuileries Gardens with the chairs, those are Sunday at the Grand Jatte. I mean, that is Seurat's understanding of what a social landscape is. There are people in Seurat, and they are navigating their landscape in a way that is Fêtes Galantes born and bred.
We also want to remind people that, and it's one of the things that Paul Leclair said at the end of our talk last time, was that Romanticism, in terms of how people looked at 18th century literature, was this enormous movement which really disempowered 18th century literature. But I remember hearing that and I'm thinking, oh gosh. And then I sent him an email and I said, well, isn't it true that Rousseau is the great, first French romantic? And he said, yes. And then I realized, well, what Rousseau was doing was right in the middle of this time of Rameau and Leclair, who was in the 1750s. So even if Romanticism, we think of it in terms of the 19th century, the actual beginning of that destabilizing element is in the 18th century at the same time that we're looking at this, pre-revolutionary literature and art. But I also wanted to make us remember that the poems of Baudelaire and Verlaine, the Fêtes Galantes, there's a series of poems called Fêtes Galantes. There's Invitation au Voyage, which is in fact it's a look at the Watteau painting, and where he talks about is poetry that no longer cares about a romantic narrative, but it's really beauty and voluptuousness and sensuality simply for its own sake. And in a funny way, it goes back, and looking at its past, into the ability to simply stand still and be beautiful, which is what I think we have in these paintings.
I also think we make, because the 20th and 21st century historian is so much happier, if you will, in the 19th century. They're always going backwards into the 18th. It really makes more sense if you, at least it makes a different kind of sense if you come forwards from the 17th to the 18th. Because much of what happens in 18th century art has counter-Reformation underpinnings. So you can't, we look at Verlaine now and we go back. But really much of, when you get to Fragonard, you see that he's a man who's gone to Italy and has understood that if what you want to do with the Fêtes Galantes is make it about sensation, about romance as sensation and feeling, then what you have to do about that is go back and look at Bernini, after all. Because those artists were artists who understood how to imbue the visual arts with sensation and passion as a way of storytelling that isn't strictly narrative, if you know what I mean. So I think part of our misunderstanding of the 18th century is because we're always coming at it from the other way, we're coming from here and going back. If we came from the 17th century and moved forward, and now when you teach the 18th century, you frequently teach it as just the front little appendage onto your 19th century class, which makes me really sad because I wish, honestly, that it would be seen, at where it ought to live, which is after the Baroque. Because it has so much more to do with that.
Just a couple of words about the music, which is that Tav told you that the people who bought Fêtes Galantes were the Fermier Général and those extraordinarily wealthy middle-class people. The Rameau pièce du Clavecin en concert after the intermission begins with a piece dedicated to the most important music patron, who was the Fermier Général, La Poudinière. who was Rameau's great patron, but also brought Stamets to Paris and had a small opera house attached to his house, which is now today the movie theater in Paris. Oh, so there it is. But it ends, this La Poupinière, this very, very wealthy Parisian man, ends with one of the most raucous tambourines you could possibly imagine. The Hunt fills the Leclair sonata. Absolutely fills it, except it has the most sophisticated, beautiful, elegant, courtly sarabande imaginable before he takes you even into a wilder tambourine than the Rameau one that you'll hear. The songs, they're two bird songs, they're incredibly charming, and they could, both of them, find themselves in a small section of a Fêtes Galantes painting of Watteau. One of the things that's a trope in folk tales in France are that apparently simple and silly people are much shrewder than you think. And Rameau's pièce de clavecin ends with La Villageoise, which means the village girl. And it starts very simply, but in fact it is so rich and so beautiful, and as you go on you begin to realize that this is a village girl with a lot to her. The rest of that needs no introduction, and the Ile de Delos, which is absolutely contemporary with Watteau's production, could actually be the soundtrack to so many of his paintings. That also, I think, will be very clear to everyone. Before we take a break in the concert, do you all have any questions that you would want to ask Tad?
What date is this Leclair painting?
Oh, isn't that nice? That's such a good painting. It's in the 1720s.
Now, in the background, it seems to me that you have more of a picnic. And that word, I don't know if it originates in
Picnic
French.
is
But picnic is
yeah.
a word.
Now that painting, which is in Germany, I wanted to show just to illustrate a couple of things. The sculpture in it is a sculpture at Versailles, a real sculpture. So Leclair, who's one of the artists that comes after Watteau, starts weaving new things in. And among the new things he weaves in are putting real things into Fêtes Galantes landscapes that everybody who saw them would know, A, was real, B, didn't live there, and that they were being asked to have a nuanced the tension between real and imaginary was something very compelling to them. So the other reason I wanted to show that painting was that Frederick the Great owned more paintings by this school than anyone else, and if you're really interested in it, you should go to Potsdam and Charlottenburg, because that is where there are 27 paintings by Leclair, 35 paintings by Pater, the Gersaint, Seymour, the Citra, among the greatest collection of art, and certainly the greatest Fêtes Galantes collection that the world has. And that is one of the paintings he bought. And yes, that's a picnic. They called it picnic.
Is there any relationship evolution from Fêtes Galantes?
I think picnic came first. I don't know about the word. I don't know about the etymology of the word itself, but outdoor people sitting around a cloth on the ground is an extremely old art subject. And in the Netherlands, you find it in the hour paintings. In the Trémicheur of the Duc de Berry, you would find people sitting outside around a cloth, eating on the ground. Yeah.
I think the Watteau paintings and some of the later paintings are very melancholy. How do you describe, because it's not, looking at the past, people apparently are wearing very clothing, there's no about it.
The question is there a sense of melancholy in the Watteau paintings? There's a few things at play there. One is the condition of Watteau is very challenging, and his darks have darkened more than the other painters that come after him. He was not tutored in the way that you can maintain shadows, so they sink. They're made of a tar-like substance called bitumen, so the backgrounds are darker than they would otherwise be. So they look a little sadder than they might otherwise look. But he was a sick man. He was a man who was sick and died very young. And there's a sense of longing in his paintings that is, I think, a very true one. And he favored the commedia figure Mezzotin, who's the halftone, whose life never resolves, whose loves never succeed. He had that sense, and he was himself, so itinerant. His friends loved him, but he would stay with them and leave quickly, and he was a grumpy guy. And his life had a lot of sadness, and I think there's an unrequited feeling in his works of art. But I do think they're darker than they were born.
But I also think when I play the music, particularly when I play Couperin, who is the closest in a lot of ways to Watteau, is that there's melancholy in that all the time as well. No matter how allegro Couperin gets, there's always underneath it the sense of a sigh. And my way of helping people to get into the head is that these are exquisite evocations of what the world might be, but that as soon as you look at the world, it isn't that at all. And there are two things. The reality of the world around you, pockmarked, where you knew that the people you loved might be dead next week from a cold that went through court. The issues of survival, which are horrible in the countryside, which you will learn if you read this guy. I mean, it's unbelievable how terrible it is. But survival at court, the comfort and the danger. I mean, you can't even survive your doctor, let alone survive the flu that's going through. And the fact that there is hardly any unblemished beauty in the world of people, because everyone is covered with smallpox. So that as you make these images of beauty, you know why you're making them, that they're not real, that wouldn't it be wonderful, wouldn't it be heavenly if this was the way it was. And then as we get later in the century, as we begin to see the ground beginning to shift, then the issue is not that they aren't real now, but whatever it is that we have now is in such terrible danger of falling around all around us, that the kind of melancholy and drama we get in Rameau and in the operas, with all the sense of tension that's underneath, this good, beautiful Rococo writing that's all over the place, is that the whole place is going to fall. Everything's going to fall apart. Nothing is based on something sustainable anymore. It's not psychologically or philosophically sustainable. It isn't economically sustainable. There's nothing about it which is sustainable. So if you're in this wonderful position at the opera house watching, whatever gorgeous thing you're watching, it's not going to be long. You realize that the things are going to change and you don't know what's going to happen.
I think the sense of fragility that you see, when you read the paper now, you do wish people paid a little more attention to their history, because the sense of fragility in France in the first 20 years of the 18th century is present in every art form. They're not kidding around. I mean, Louis XIV didn't have a child who became king. He didn't have a grandchild who became king. These people all died of smallpox. The rivers froze. Everything, the bread, molded and died, or there wasn't any. I mean, this was a very, the sense of the fragility of not just human life, but of society and the way people lived, was a very real and present thing. And Watteau is the kind of genius who is really able to evoke and conjure that, even when the images themselves have that sort of internal beauty. It is less present, I would say, and really why some of the artists that come after him come into more modern criticism. It's a little less present in, say, Leclair, who has a more narrative style and is brighter in his storytelling. And then Fragonard is telling us something completely different, but no less significant.
We need to stop this now.
No.
I need to have about 10 minutes to think about being a harpsichordist. But thank you so much for this. Thank you for being here.